Welcome everyone. I'm sure others will join as well, but we will get started because we have a full schedule today and only 1 hour. Welcome to the third panel discussion of AI ethics global perspectives. My name is Stefaan Verhulst. I'm one of the course leaders of the course, and I'm here together with Julia Stoyanovich, who will also co-moderate the effort. Julia, you want to briefly introduce yourself?
Welcome, everybody. I'm Julia Stoyanovich, and I'm looking forward to a fascinating conversation.
Great. Thanks, everyone, for joining. As I mentioned, this is the third panel discussion of AI Ethics Global Perspectives. And AI Ethics Global Perspectives is a course that is co-produced by the GovLab, the Global Consortium on AI Ethics, the Center for Responsible AI at New York University, and also the Institute for Ethics of Artificial Intelligence based at the Technical University of Munich. And the course is intended to bring different video lectures every week, every month, that approaches AI ethics from a different, quite often geographically different point of view. And today, we are delighted to share with you and also invite those that have submitted their video lecture this month. And Julia will briefly introduce them before we go into the substance of the panel today. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you, Stefan. It is my great pleasure to introduce 4 distinguished panelists. I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak. The first to speak is Shannon Valor. She is the Baillie Gifford Chair in the Ethics of Data and Artificial Intelligence at the University of Edinburgh's Futures Institute, where she is also appointed as professor in philosophy. Shannon's research explores the philosophy and ethics of emerging science and technologies. Her current research projects focus on the impact of emerging technologies, particularly those involving automation and artificial intelligence, on the moral and intellectual habits, skills, and virtues of human beings, our character. Shannon's work investigates how human character is being transformed by rapid advances in AI, robotics, new social media, surveillance, and biomedical technologies. Her work has appeared in numerous journals. She is the editor of the forthcoming Oxford Handbook of Philosophy of Technology, and is also currently working on a new book on the subject of AI and ethics called The AI Mirror: Rebuilding Humanity in the Age of Machine Thinking. Such an exciting title. I'm looking forward to reading your book, Shannon, once it's out. Next to speak will be Ken Ito. He is a Japanese composer and professor of music, brain, cognitive information philosophy and ethics at the University of Tokyo. Such an eclectic set of affiliations and interests. Born in Tokyo, Ken Ito studied composition and piano under Teizo Matsumura and several other distinguished speakers whose names I worry that I will not be able to pronounce correctly. Of the people with whom he studied, of course, I recognize the name of Leonard Bernstein, under whom he studied conducting. Ken earned an MA in solid state physics and a PhD in fundamentals of music from the University of Tokyo, where his research focuses on an interdisciplinary work of music, physical, and brain cognitive sciences. Since 1999, he has been working as a professor of composition, conducting, and fundamental informatics at the University of Tokyo, where his research interests also include the ethical aspects of media and information. Last but not least, Ken organized and played cross-disciplinary projects and performances between music and basic sciences at the National University of Rwanda, high schools in Fukushima, and more recently, online classes and performances due to COVID-19. Welcome, Ken. Next to speak will be Serge Abiteboul, my colleague and dear friend. Serge is a senior researcher at the Institut National de Recherche en Informatique and Automatique in RIA, that is the French National Research Institute, focusing on computer science and related areas. Serge has been a professor of the Collège de France. He is known for his many contributions in the areas of finite model theory, database theory, and database systems. And as a database researcher myself, I have had the pleasure of learning from Serge's books and from Serge himself. In 2008, according to CiteSeer, he was the most highly cited researcher in data management who works at a European institution. In addition to his contributions to computer science, Serge is also known for his books, including textbooks on database theory and on web data management, but also he's been writing fiction and he's been producing art. Serge frequently writes for French newspapers, including Le Monde, Libération, and La Tribune. And since a few years ago, he's been a member of ARCEP, that is the independent agency in charge of regulating telecommunications in France, where he has been advocating on net neutrality. Serge has also been critical of virtual assistants and their impact on privacy. And we will hear from Serge today. Last but not least, I would like to introduce Richard Benjamins. Dr. Richard Benjamins is Chief AI and Data Strategist at Telefónica. According to Data IQ 2018, he is among the 100 most influential people in data-driven business. Richard is a co-founder and vice president of the Spanish Observatory for Ethical and Social Impacts of AI. He was Group Chief Data Officer at AXA Insurance, and before that held for 10 years executive positions at Telefónica on big data and analytics. Richard is the founder of Telefónica's Big Data for Social Good Department, a member of the B2G Data Sharing Expert Group of the European Commission, and also a frequent speaker at artificial intelligence events. He holds a PhD in cognitive sciences and has published over 100 scientific articles, is also an author of the books The Myth of the Algorithm, Tales and Tools of Artificial Intelligence in Spanish, and another book that is forthcoming, and that is A Data-Driven Company. Welcome, Richard. Over to you, Stefaan.
Thanks, Julia. Well, I don't have much to add, except for saying that we will first have the panelists reflect on their video based upon a set of questions that Julia and I will pose, and then we will have Q&A, hopefully at the end for about 15 minutes. So if you have a question, feel free to add it to the Q&A button on the bottom of our Zoom window here, and then we will make sure that we address that either during the sessions by adding some answers or responses in the Q&A, or we will make sure that we come back to the Q&A at the end of the panelists' introductions and observations. Over to you, Julia, to get us started with Shannon.
Once again, welcome, Shannon. Your very interesting module, the title of your module is Do Care Bots Care? The Ethics of Social Robots in Care Settings. Your module explores the ethical implications of robotics, and in particular, the ethical issues that emerge from social robots that are deployed in care settings. Could you please tell us for a few minutes about some of the limitations, risks, and advantages of using care bots across varying contexts and applications?
Sure, happy to. Thanks, and thanks for inviting me to take part in this today. So I think there's two main limitations that we have to consider here. And these limitations are often not anticipated, sometimes by policymakers and members of the public who imagine what care bots might do for us in care settings. One set of limitations involves simply the challenges of biomechanical engineering for robots that are going to interact with human bodies. The challenges are very, very different than building the kinds of robots that operate in safe sandboxes in factory environments where they can be kept within a very predictable environment. A care facility is one of the most unpredictable environments. You have lots of things that can happen. You can have a physical fall. You can have patients who become delirious and act unpredictably. And so getting a physical robot, which under even unusual circumstances will operate safely and won't present a danger to human bodies is quite challenging. It's also means that it has taken longer than some people expected to make progress in areas that would be very, very desirable for care bots. For example, helping lift patients out of bed, helping patients to the toilet. These were some of the earliest ideas about how care bots would be useful, but it has not been easy to commercially develop robots that can perform these kinds of tasks. So where you have seen more advancement more rapidly is with the use of social robots engaging in more of the interpersonal dimensions of care. A second area of development has been robots that are performing something like a monitoring or a surveillance function, where they're observing patients, recording data about patient activities, and then using that to, for example, flag anomalies for human attention. So for example, if a patient has fallen or has not taken their medication, you might be able to have a robot signal a human that something is awry, or to use robots as modes of telepresence for family members or caregivers or physicians to check in on people in care settings remotely. So those have been the areas of application that have developed more rapidly. So the limitations then of actually engineering robots that can physically care for us are actually holding back some applications, and will be probably doing so for quite a bit of time. Another limitation is the lack of contextual understanding of any current artificial intelligence system that would be implemented in a robot. These systems cannot care because they cannot understand what it is to care, or what it is to be a subject of care, or to need care. These systems, even when they are quite convincing and warm in their presentation, are essentially what we call, zombies. They're dead inside. There's no understanding of the circumstances that they're in, or the nature of the relationships that they may form. So that creates an asymmetry, because nevertheless, social robots are very easy for people in care settings to feel connected to form attachments with, and to feel like they're actually engaging in a reciprocal exchange. So we have that limitation where from the patient or resident side, something is happening that from the robot side is not understood, even though they may be able to successfully participate in it within certain kind of bounded circumstances. So those are the two main limitations. In terms of the risks and advantages, I'll start with the advantages. Human care is really, really hard, and it's really, really draining. And most human caregivers, whether they're at home or whether they're paid caregivers in a facility, are overstretched, under supported. Robots are not a fix for that. They're not a fix for the fact that we don't value care work properly, and that we don't raise it to a high enough status, that we don't compensate caregivers appropriately. Robots aren't going to fix any of that. But nevertheless, even under ideal circumstances, human caregiving is something that requires support. It's rarely something you can do without respite, without a break, and without some assistance. So one thing that robots really can do is augment and support human caregiving, and allow human caregivers to be less exhausted, less drained, and better able to give the kind of care that they want to give in a care setting. So if we use robots in that way, we will have better outcomes. It's also interesting that even though there are some privacy risks around robots, especially those that are involved in monitoring applications, there's from some research evidence that care recipients might welcome robots in certain settings as ways to preserve their privacy and dignity, precisely because the robots are dead inside and they can't judge, right? The robots might be able to be assisting someone in a very intimate situation where they would be embarrassed to have another human present assisting them. And so some care recipients for some kinds of activities may welcome having a robot that can be assisting them without passing judgment or without provoking feelings of shame. We've also seen evidence that some social robots, like, for example, Paro, the robot seal that has been used for a long time now in care settings, can facilitate human interaction. So one of the risks we worry about is robots replacing human interaction, but it doesn't have to be that way. In many contexts, robots can actually stimulate humans to interact with each other more in the way, for example, that pets often do, right? When a dog or a cat runs into the room, people don't ignore each other. They actually get more animated and engaged with one another, talking about what the pet is doing. And we can have similar dynamics with robots if we have the right kind of design. And then finally, robots can perhaps enable more independence and allow people perhaps to stay at home with more support with family members who maybe don't feel as overtaxed and might not be as tempted to place someone who needs care in a facility outside the home if the robot can provide that kind of assistance. The risks are, as I mentioned, that we will use robots in the wrong ways, that we'll use them as substitutes for human caregiving, that we'll use them without recognition of the ethical risks. There's risks that people will be deceived by robots and manipulated by them, not because the robots will deliberately do this, but because there could be commercial interests behind the robot that could exploit the attachment to the robot that a care recipient has. And there are risks of, I think, using robots as a way to not worry about the people who are being neglected. The idea that, well, as long as a robot is taking care of grandma, she's not alone really, and she's safe, so we don't have to worry so much about making time to go visit her and so forth. We would want to make sure that those sorts of dynamics aren't reinforced by robots.
This is really fascinating. I mean, I wonder whether we have an understanding at all about how to balance these benefits and the risks. Let's say just singling out that one aspect of people getting emotionally attached to a machine.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, the benefits of that are clear, but then also it's deceptive. So is there some way for us to reason about this?
Yeah, well, I think we can take some lessons from, you know, the broader understanding that design of computational systems that humans interact with should be participatory and co-driven by the people who are going to be affected by these systems. So we need to be doing more work with the recipients of care and people who might be in that situation. Talk to people, for example, maybe who are at high risk for dementia, who might be at a later stage really in a position to be deceived by robot interactions. Maybe we can talk to people before they're at that stage about the limits and benefits and risks and advantages of robot care, and find out what people want, what they're comfortable with, what they would feel as ethically acceptable in their care. These are things that I think we don't do enough to sort of get that kind of input from the people who will be most affected by these systems. And I think we also need to understand that there are cultural differences globally in how people want to relate to robots and machines. And so we need to avoid a one-size-fits-all approach and look at what are the relationships that, I think what we really want to focus on is what are the human relationships and forms of flourishing that exist in a given context that we want to preserve for people when they need care? And how can we use the robots to preserve those forms of human flourishing and human interaction that they consider as central to a good life? How can we make sure that the robots we design are facilitating that?
Excellent points. Thank you very much, Shannon. We will come back to you, I hope, during the Q&A. Stefaan, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, Shannon. And so building upon what was discussed really about also the differences from different cultures to look at the ethical implications of AI, I really would recommend everyone to watch and visit Ken's video, which is almost like a composition in its own right. It has 3 parts, and it's almost like, anyway, it flows and it's very rich from a variety of points of views. You will see that Ken tries to connect, anyway, algorithmic bias with notions of history and music, but also an approach that is enshrined in practices of Zen, and how that might ultimately relate to how we deal with algorithmic biases. One core element, Ken, that you feature within your lecture is the notion of relativity, and how that also relates with algorithmic bias. And so eager to know from you, Ken, what's the connection? How do you approach algorithmic bias? And especially building upon what Shannon said, so what's the cultural perspective that you bring that is different than what we perhaps might have here in the West?
Yeah. First of all, thank you very much for your kind invitation. And as my talk is somehow totally complicated, so I have prepared a series of the slide, and can I also share?
Sure.
And also this afternoon, because I have worked for 3 years as a director of a TV program, orchestral weekly TV program during 1990s. So for me, filming and recording and so forth is very natural, everyday custom. So I have already made the answer. So I will put the URL to the chat, and it takes 7 minutes and half. I hope within 8 minutes, but I think I also add some additional explanation on the algorithmic bias itself and so forth. And first of all, the slideshow. Okay. You see that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I've already received 2 questions about the relativity within the recording. My mistake was not a relativity, but I written a reality or something. Please forgive. And the second question is within my model, how do I exploit the lesson from the field of music and physics and apply them, blah, blah, blah. And I will give very short 2 questions. The first one is, no AI is absolute. A very clear question, and then the answer. He says, I'm relative. And this is the first answer. And second one, what kind of lessons from the field of the music and the physics, blah, blah, blah. But so I dare say, I'm very sorry, I'm nasty man, but big data is AI output down or something like that. So, or garbage in.
I want to briefly intervene, is that the slideshow is not running for us. So I don't know.
Oh, really?
Perhaps you need to do something extra.
By now, I will try it. Slideshow, this one. Is it okay? No?
I think now it works, yeah.
Okay, so once I go back to the third, no. The first question is the relativity, and the second one is about the lesson, possible lesson. And the first question and the first answer is no AI is absolute by definition, especially for the social big data represent. And the second answer for the question is garbage in, garbage out. They are very common, very audible things, but I'd like to follow in some different causes. All AI has intrinsic data bias inherent. And bias-free, absolute social big data could exist, but only in a wonderland. And this is my or our starting point. The mirror, mirror on the wall, which AI in this land is the fairest of all. This kind of question could be possible, But I think it's almost nonsense, especially, of course, an AI ethics or AI conclusions are very important. But for me, also the reality, even if you can break the mirror, you can change in the output of so-called AI calculation, but the ugly reality of the society still never disappear. This kind of point, this is a very important point because we can also observe or detect the reality, hidden reality of our society itself through those data mining. This is also very, very important point. One of my best friends, he is already retired, but professor of robotics. And when I was listening from the very beautiful lecture or comment, I thought his name was is Dr. Nakamura, and he had given a very impressive lecture in the Collège de France today. I'm very happy to be with Serge, but he had talked. He had given a talk about a lethal weapon and autonomous intelligence in killing or mass murder or something like this. Very, very important point. And there also, Dr. Nakamura has stressed the importance. It's not only the algorithm itself, but the reality. We shall think those two always simultaneously. And then once go back to somehow scientific talk, the all contemporary AI or statistic sciences are from the roots in Friedrich Gauss himself. Nobody will have any question, but Dr. Gauss or Professor Gauss himself was the director of the Göttingen Observatory during his lifetime, and his statistical model has much to do with the rigid body model or a dynamical model of the nebula or galaxy or planetary system, etc. This kind of way of thinking is for me myself because my background is physics. But before him, I mean before Gauss, astronomy by Kepler or Isaac Newton himself was much more astrological ones. Of course, there are astronomy, but also fortune telling or something. At least the kings or emperors, they had put some amount of money for the observatory, not for the very pure scientific aim, but also for not fortune telling, but some astrological future expectation or something. And the so-called harmonious mundi or universe, harmony of the universe or octave theory, well-known octave theory in the cosmology between quotation was mythical, not at all like similar to contemporary quantitative objective science. And they were telling fortune. On the contrary, but in our contemporary AI also tells expectations, but also through observation. Known observation of the 17th century and contemporary IoT, smart sensor or every point possible sensory. That's so much different, but the observation and the data stacking and a certain kind of algorithm calculation was made, and some expectation or some fortune would be told. But in both cases, precise data taking leads truths. This is very important. This is everybody knows about the LIGO observatory. And one of my good best friend, Dr. Kawabe, is working in Caltech, and we have 35 years very long friendship, but he is working very hard on this, and a very precise observation is made. Data faking is not at all, only is a post-truth. From biased data set, biased realities are inevitably revealed. I put some journalistic and captures there, but that's all. Everybody can easily understand the reality of the situation. Let's go back to the history of science and music. Descartes' Compendium Musicae, 1618, is one of the first pure mathematical and theoretical contribution to the music theory, without any universe harmonia mundi, but a very quantitative and a very precise. And this is also the first application of the polar coordinate. And but was never published during his lifetime. And afterwards, it was published, and then Isaac Newton shown the shock and so forth. And a very beautiful tale and a story I have read in Chandrasekhar's book, Moved. But at any rate, after Descartes, things have changed. And how about the music mathematics of Leonhard Euler? Euler's music mathematics is the very starting point of his complex analysis. And also the Simon, everybody knows that the Pierre-Simon Laplace, the celestial mechanics. This is the very starting point of that. After this 19th century, not only physics, not only dynamics or electrodynamics, but almost every theoretical science starts from this celestial mechanics. It's very, very important. And also contemporary study, which supports music, are also somehow data-driven sciences. And for this almost 35 years. But indeed, with the very sudden passing away of Pierre Boulez, it has once stopped. But now I'm continuing this with IRCAM, with my friends over there. But I will shortly introduce my own project. Pierre Boulez and me, myself, doing some so-called spectral conducting. But this is also precisely quantitative data taking is a starting point. And so precisely data taking without any artificial secondary algorithmic change. This is very important. And so now I skip this because this is the motion picture. But so it reveals even inner sense of music phrasing, etc., even posthumously. This kind of research is we started, but very, very, for me at least, important. We are continuing something like this between not only Paris and Tokyo, but with Munich, Tokyo, Berlin, Tokyo, and hopefully with the United States. Now not. And also we can reveal inner sense or some feeling, which is not easy with words literally, but from the very minute motion or the speed or acceleration or angular momentum or something we can reveal. And also this is applicable for subliminal motion or fluctuations of the instrumental playing performance. I now cut some, but something like this we're doing. And so as an AI user, we're working on this kind of a system every day. Now, on one hand, of course, we're practical musicians, we play, but also we're doing, just like this is following the case of an Ensemble Contemporain and IRCAM's case in Paris. And so I am totally thankful for the French predecessor. Not only Pierre Boulez, but he is the most important teacher of me. And my brief conclusion to then Stefan's question is the so-called algorithmic bias is somehow pseudo question. Not a remedy, but avoidance is necessary. This is fundamentally data bias problem. And the statistical moments of the model data should be precisely measured. And I think this should be widely announced and finally socially overcome. Different inertial momentum gives a different motion of the nebula or a galaxy. Also, a different bias in racial bias or gender bias, the bias related to the pandemics, land biases of mother data directly reflect to the so-called algorithm biased system. So the second answer I firstly mentioned, big data is that AI put out, put down, but garbage in, garbage out. This point is so so-called bias is precisely measured social reality. They exist, and for value neutral and neutral AI calculation, neutral evaluation of the model dataset by profit neutral third party. is very, very important. I convince it. So before any AI-based decision making, we shall know this AI, that AI, this AI is a relative polarization is so-so, and make use of it with that pre-assumption, knowing the characteristics of the tool, and then makes it. This is my very ordinary, very not at all a strange impression that we can and we shall evaluate the deviation, the polarization, and every possible biases precisely, both technically and ethically. And then now I put the mark of the Global AI Ethics Consortium, and not only the Global AI Ethics Consortium. Of course, we'd like to work with the GovLab, we'd like to work with the French or Spanish, every possible, as long as they are third party and profit-free agencies. We'd like to have the international collaboration to propose that gigantic component companies even should play the role to check the mother data, its polarization, and rate them. This is very important. AI is not at all absolute. They are relative. This is my point. Thank you very much.
Wow, Ken, thanks so much for this whirlwind of ideas and even summarizing history of multiple strands of thinking, and so you also set the floor by even reference to Pierre Boulez to go straight to Serge, perhaps, and see whether there are any connections between Pierre and Serge moving forward. But we will come back to you, Ken. And again, thanks for sharing also the video that provides the answer. And I'm sure many will want to ponder over your presentation. So if it's okay with you, we will also post your presentation next to your video later today as well. So thanks so much, Ken. And over to you, Serge. And then we can come back to all of your conversations and observations.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, so let me just lead with a question for Serge. Welcome, Serge. In your module, you discuss content moderation in social media and the relationship between that and AI, of course. As you say, we love to communicate, we love to share, to debate, to exchange information. And this is why we developed social media. But now there are some concerns that the use of social media is raising. Can you speak a little bit about some of these ethical concerns that have arisen due to the proliferation of social media, and what one can do to mitigate them, and who should be responsible for mitigating some of the issues that arise?
Thank you, Julia. About the ethical concerns raised by social media, you just have to open the newspapers. So we all know by using them most of the time how great they are. You know, they allow to enrich our relations, they tighten link with friends, we express opinions, it facilitates local democracy. It's a great tool. But on the other hand, you hear about hate speech, harassment, fake news, information bubble, government mass surveillance, terrorism, and so on and so on. So essentially, it's very clear, at least to me, that they are fantastic, but we would like them to help us improve society and not accentuate problems, which they seem to do for the moment. So that's the ethical concerns. So you mentioned something extremely important, Julia, in your question, which is responsibility. Because basically, you know, are they responsible for what they're doing? And the answer is that for a very long time, they were legally not responsible, at least in the US, because there was a law, which is Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act 1996, which said something like that: no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as a publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. I don't know if it's clear, but in short, it's open bar. You can let the users write whatever they like, It's none of your responsibility as a social media. And that's in the US, but we had something similar in Europe with the Article 14 of the e-commerce directive in 2001. So the funny part for me is that if you look at the dates, 1996, 2001, this is before the birth of social media. So actually the laws that are governing the social media were just drawn before they even existed. So are they exactly the same between Europe and the US? Not quite, because there is a very fundamental difference of interpretation of freedom of speech. In the US, the interpretation is completely religious, freedom of speech, period. In Europe, we accept limitations. So freedom of speech is a right, but it's a right, but that is accepting limitation. And we have seen existing laws coming, for instance, NetzDG in Germany. And most importantly, there is a forthcoming law in Europe, which is a Digital Service Act, that's going to try to essentially tame social media. But of course, you want to do that without too much, and I insist on the too much, without too much limiting freedom of speech. Now, if you talk about this responsibility, I think even in the US, it's discussed. Actually, even the social media themselves started to basically destroy the myth of their lack of response, of not being responsible. How do you see that? Just see what happened with President Trump. He was basically banned from social media. And that is, if you do that, it's because you admit your responsibility. And that's very important. It's really a change in philosophy. Now, let's come back to content moderation, because the way you work against all these bad, horrible content is by blocking them, and you do content moderation. So essentially, what's the problem? The content media receives a piece of content that a user wants to publish, and the media has to decide, okay, published, or not okay, I block it. I may block it as a social media, I may block it because it's illegal. Okay, so I don't have the choice. And now it's not so easy because the law varies from country to country. I can also block it just because I think it's inappropriate. It does not meet the terms of use of my social media. So what I do is I oversimplify it a little bit, because besides blocking or letting it go, you have different means such as flagging it and so on. But just to make it simple, go, not go, okay? Now I want to stress that it's not easy. First of all, it's not easy because of the, as computer scientists, what we know a lot, which is the 3 V's: volume, variety, velocity. Huge data, very different kinds, going very fast. Second difficulty, it comes from human, and that's based on language. And there are language issues like language ambiguity, use of slang, use of humor, makes it more difficult for machines. There is also something that makes it more difficult, is a lack of content. You have a piece of content and typically you don't have the context. You don't know who wrote it, you don't know what happened before. That's for privacy concerns, basically protecting privacy, but it makes it more difficult. Not easy for a human to do that. You've probably seen also that it's not easy for a human to be exposed to a flow of trash 8 hours a day. That's really difficult. You have like psychological issues. Humans have also biases. So basically it's very difficult for humans. Naturally, if humans have difficulties with it, let's have machines do it. And of course, let's have AI do it. So recall the goal. You have a piece of content, you feed it into an algorithm, and the algorithm has to decide, yes, no. I keep it, I trash it, okay? And what is going to be based on? What is this decision going to be based on? First of all, there is some kind of meta level. You can think of it as ontologies, rules that define what's not appropriate. You can also think of it as some kind of applied ethics, okay? So basically rules that's the people of the social media have designed, which is defining what they want to accept. And then you have the data level, which is for us the most important part, which is a large corpus of contents with annotations. Yeah, that's okay. That's fake news. That's hate speech. That's violent speech. Who has drawn the annotations? Humans. So humans have written these annotations and they're used now by the algorithm. And now you can see the algorithm is you train a learning algorithm so that it can mimic the decisions that are already in the corpus. Okay. You find a new content, what does it look like? Okay. Does it look like more like these contents that have been refused or like this one? And of course, you can do things a bit more complex by trying to find in the content, you know, who is aggressed, who is the aggressor, what verb is used, and so on. You can do lots of things, but basically, there is this decision at the end, yes, no. Okay, now that we have that, what's the status today? What can algorithm do today? So as you know, if you've seen a little bit these kind of things, it's clear that it's going to be much easier with text than with images. And it turns out that some topics, they are better. Like for terrorism and pedopornography, they're just better. Perhaps because it's easier, perhaps also because there is a general agreement on what you should prevent from going on the net. Everybody agrees that terrorism is bad and pretty much agrees what the you know, content with terrorism is, and that's important. Now, if you go to hard speech, already much harder. If you go to fake news, it's even harder. And you know, you see these levels where basically the gray area becomes bigger. You know, you have the white, obviously good. You have the black, obviously bad, and you have something in between. You know, sometimes if you ask a lawyer, even the lawyer would not know whether it's you know, I was with lawyers and asked them, is this particular content okay? And discussed two lawyers discussed like for half an hour, and at the end they say, well, you know, you just have to go to court and the court will decide. That's a gray area. So now what are algorithms doing today? So first of all, algorithms already detect more bad content than humans. Typically what happens is they detect that the content is not acceptable, and then there is a human being who actually you know, validates the decision to block the content. Now, what about the quality of these algorithms? So now I'm going to use a private source, actually a couple of private sources in different companies that told me that algorithm in these, you know, in the main players were already better than humans for hate speech text. So you see how cautious I am. It's only hate speech, it's only text, and these are private sources. I cannot, you know, prove it to you. Basically, what's the story? The story is, one, it's difficult to get precise measures. And also the second thing, these companies are keeping it extremely opaque. It's changing slowly, but very slowly. And right now, today, I can just give you a feeling. Algorithms are getting better. They're better already in some areas than humans, but they're not that perfect. I think I've said more or less what I wanted to say. Maybe a last point, which I think is worth mentioning, is this corpus, these corpora are very critical, because basically if you want to do moderation, content moderation, you need them. But only the big companies can build them. And you cannot make it open data because of, you know, private concerns. So basically we have to find a way of sharing these corpora between different social media so that the small ones can survive, and also with researchers so that the researchers can help improve. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Serge. In the interest of time, I'll hand over to Stefaan to speak with Richard, and then I'm hoping that we will have a few minutes for questions at the end.
Yeah, and we might go a little bit over time, but this has already been very interesting, and it's kind of interesting that there are different, anyway, different topics, but there are some commonalities. One, like for instance, anyway, the notion of freedom of speech is not absolute, but also AI is not absolute. So there's a notion of relativity there, and actually we do need to have a certain level of responsibility. And then the other notion of values in design, right? That was also coming back over and over again. And a key element that Serge, Richard touched upon was, of course, responsibility. And so that's also what the topic is of your lecture, which is really about what's the responsibility of companies in order to have responsible AI. And so over to you, Richard, on how can corporations become more responsible as it relates to the use of AI within their own organization.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll try to be very brief. I think maybe some of you know that the European Commission published today its new AI regulation. So the very short answer is, if you are a company, you want to be responsible with AI, move to Europe, yeah? Because then you are regulated, and it's a very specific regulation. It's too early to have a clear opinion, but it is a risk-based approach. And I can already say that the care bots that we just heard about fall under the regulation with regard to the safety components, not harming physically people. And the talk of Serge about an AI algorithm that decides whether to accept or not a certain piece of content might fall under it as well in terms of influencing democratic processes and those kinds of related things. Yeah. Having said that, so far, there is lots of discussion on AI ethics, what companies should do and can do. Lots of companies have been publishing their AI principles. It's not always easy to select them. So in the lecture, there are some criteria that you can use to select what kind of principles are appropriate for your company, depending on your sector, depending on whether you can control those things or not, and depending on whether they are unintended or intended. And then the second challenge that companies have is, how do I implement that in my business as usual? Yeah? So it's relatively easy to make statements, but then follow up on those statements in your day-to-day work is quite complex. Yeah? And there's not a lot of experience. And with the new regulation, there is actually a full process specified that you need to do if you want to deploy a high-risk AI system. And indeed, you also have to do it before you launch it to the market. So this is going to have quite a significant impact for the high-risk AI applications. I leave it there, Stefaan.
Great, thanks, Richard. And it also relates to actually a question that was posed to Shannon on actually, should there be release kind of an assessment, which also is what Ken actually referred to with regard to assessing, of course, what I thought was a kind of an interesting framing, which was assessing the mother data of that goes into the algorithm and releasing, assessing that before actually we start relying on the AI, which might create unintended or at least aligned kind of results. But one more question to you, Richard, and then Julia will facilitate the Q&A, which is that you also released this week a paper on the need for independence of AI ethics researchers. And of course, that relates to a variety of high-profile cases where AI ethics researchers have been pushed out of corporations because they became critical and their independence was at stake. So can you, 2 minutes, reflect on what is the key proposal there and why should we care?
I think, yeah, thanks for the question. I think so. This is a multi-author, I think 10 authors or so, or something like that. So I think we all 10 have a common view, but there are also, of course, many different views on the same topic. So in that respect, I will give mine. Indeed, this is triggered by the high-level cases that happened at Google. And the point is here that we don't want to do a shaming of certain organizations, but highlight the underlying issues. What is at stake? Yeah? So what is at stake here, and that's important, is about AI ethics research. Yeah? So this is researchers who study the aspects of ethics of AI. It's not any AI research. Yeah? It's the ethics of AI research. And what we see is that due to the fact that very few companies in the world are now employing many of the best researchers in the world, who used to be at universities where they could do whatever they thought was necessary to do, now they can't always. Yeah? So it's about highlighting that problem and what should be done about it. Yeah? It is not about corporations in general that are censoring researchers. Yeah, so I'm working at a corporation. I do a lot of research, and of course, before I publish something, it goes through a machine. Yeah, is it no confidential information? Does it harm the reputation? And sometimes, well, this might put us in a bad light. So that's happening all the time. And researchers who go to corporations, they know that. Yeah. But if you speak about fundamental AI ethics research, that should be completely independent. Yeah? And otherwise, you run the risk of what happened in with the tobacco industry and with the auto industry, etc. Yeah? So it's fundamentally because those big tech companies are doing something that used to be the realm of independent organizations, and currently it's not only.
Thanks, Richard. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you. So let's spend about 5 or 7 minutes. I hope that we can spare the time to go through some of the very interesting questions that folks have been posting to Q&A. And I'll take them out of order. So one question that I personally even have a very strong opinion about is, what is AI? How do we actually define AI? As Michael says, a fundamental question is, which of the 8 to 10 different definitions of AI, ranging back from 1957, are the EU and each of you using? And why only regulate AI algorithms? A lot of very harmful decisions are made when bad data is plugged into spreadsheets and faulty computer models. So for those of you who would like to speak on this, I'd love to hear your views. Serge, maybe you first.
Yes. So first of all, to the second part. The second part is, for me, there is nothing sacred about AI. I know what informatics is, and basically that's where ethics should be planned. Actually, ethics should be designed for technology in general, and one technology is informatics. And I don't think there is anything specific in AI. Now, for the question of what is AI, I'm very naive. I go back to the original one, the first one from Turing, which is AI is what makes you you making a computer do that you would say is intelligent if it's performed by a human. It's not the exact sentencing, but that's the idea. If you think it's intelligent when a human does it, then it's artificial intelligence when the computer does it. And beside that, I don't really know what it means. Now, the problem is, for a lot of people, it's machine learning, or it's very specific. For me, it's everything that's intelligent. Theorem proving, computer-based theorem proving, that's AI, as much as detecting a tumor with a deep neural network.
Thank you, Serge. I strongly agree with your answer. Would anyone else like to speak to this? Richard, perhaps?
Well, I think there are a few specific things on AI. I think it's not so important to discuss the definition. Of course, it's important to have a definition, but it doesn't make sense to spend hours and hours because nobody will agree. But I think there are a few things that are distinguishable by current AI. Yeah? First is completely data-driven, most of the AI today. Yeah, so that doesn't include rule-based and other things, but data-driven means that the machine learns patterns and makes mistakes. Yeah, now those mistakes are different than previous algorithms because they were more or less deterministic, because they were programmed mostly. And this has a lot of impacts on, first on if the data is not good, the outcome has false positives, false negatives, what's the impact of that? That's something that's very specific to AI. If the system is learning, once it is in operation, and it continues to learning without any supervision, then the system might end up doing something that nobody had foreseen, even with systems today. That's also something that is very specific to to AI, but only happens to very few AI systems. Yeah? And then it's the explainability. Yeah? And some algorithms are difficult to understand, not even by the programmers. And that is also something that is different. So therefore, there are all kinds of ethical questions with these kind of systems.
Thank you, Richard. Let me go quickly to Shannon because I realized that she has to leave. Shannon, I'd love to get your answer on a question that one person asked in Q&A that was about trust. How do we build trust in socio-technical systems? And you spoke to this already a little bit, but if you could maybe elaborate just a bit more.
Yeah, and unfortunately I have to run because I'm running an interview in 3 minutes ago, so I have to leave. But I did put a response to that question in the Q&A text. So hopefully you can see it there in the answered section. So I hope that's useful. But I'll just add one last thing before I leave, that we trust people and institutions, not machines. Machines are the things through which our trust can pass, but they must pass to someone who can care for the things we've entrusted to them. Trust means putting something of ours that we care about in the hands of someone who can care for it, who we trust to care for it. And because machines today can't care, we must never make the mistake of thinking that we trust or ought to trust machines, as opposed to socio-technical systems, of which machines can be one part, but it's the humans in that system who are responsible for upholding our trust. So that's it. And thanks, everybody. It was a great conversation. Bye.
So I wonder if I should ask another question or if we should wrap.
I think there's a lot of discussion about definition.
Right.
And,
so let me actually,
which is definition of AI or definition of independent. And so, so I would suggest, Julia, perhaps to go around here and everyone have some last observations, and perhaps also observations about what they heard from the other panelists. And so, so it would be great to, for instance, also hear anyway what Richard thought of Ken's presentation, and what Ken, anyway, any reactions from Ken to what you heard. Ken heard from Richard and from Serge, because a lot of it was actually anyway, it could be connected with your observation, and then we will close. Is that okay with you, Julia?
Yes, absolutely. And if I may just add editorially, many people seem to be interested in regulation, right? How can we oversee the use of these systems so as to build trust? So if you feel like commenting on that, I'd also be very interested to hear.
Yeah, and Serge, of course, being as a regulator, I'm sure might also have some views on that. So, so why don't we start with Ken, perhaps, because we've already heard from Richard and Serge as well. But Ken, so any quick reactions to what you've heard from Richard and Serge, or any of the questions, and then we go to Richard and Serge. You will have the last word.
I was so much moved in almost every presentation that says comment. And Richard, I'm so much sorry, I mistyped Benjamin. Thank you, Benjamin. I shall type Richard.
Don't worry.
But about the not talking about the minute details or very delicate details, but I'd like to add only one short comment about the definition or something like that. Not the definition of AI in a recent contemporary meaning, but how about the intelligence or some deus ex machina like something? And from last year, I have some very special research project, ancient Chinese philosophical way of thinking based on mathematics. And that has much to do with Fourier transformation or something, but totally different, seemingly, but they have some common root. And from this kind of point of view, also about the responsibility, or especially for how about the death penalty or something like that, or some revenge by law or something like that in ancient Mesopotamian Urk codes or Hammurabi codes. Also, I have worked somehow for because I had worked on this for the ethical codes for the autonomous car driving. This is somehow strange, but I enjoyed this very, very much because think of the case of Gorgon, where some creature, imaginary creature, which has several heads and brain, and they can, from time to time, have some contradiction within it. And certain kind of a Greek ancient myth is very, very interesting to think over this kind of problem. And I, with my good friend, best friend, Christoph Rüttiger, we have talked some amount about this, and especially the starting point of the IAEA, the Taiwan Ethical AI Ethics Center, Research Center. And so about the definition of AI, there must be many different opinions, but I think from certain kind of ethical or philosophical point of view, we can grasp the problem somehow from totally different angle. And there could be some different breakthrough, hopefully. And now I'm in Tokyo, and I'm watching the world from totally different angle. I'd like to do some contribution also on this kind of totally different standpoint and the viewpoint. Thank you very much.
Great, Ken, and exactly that's what we hope to do with the course, is to actually get different perspectives on what quite often is a narrow discussion. And so, Richard, over to you, some final observations.
Well, I think just to Ken, as I mentioned only to the panelists, his presentation that reminded me of the book Gödel and Bar of Douglas Hofstadter. It's a book that relates AI, maths, and art. And actually, it was the reason why I started to study cognitive science and AI many years ago. So it's a great, it was a good inspirer. And on Serge, I think deciding what is good to publish on those platforms or not definitely is a regulated piece of AI, because it decides on the fundamental right of freedom of speech, and it might have a lot of impact on democratic processes. So very interesting, and I'm sure if you are doing that as a regulator, and I mean, all those platforms need to do it, and actually they already do it. So they need to get their act together and to see how they influence those human rights.
Great. Serge, you're the last, you have the last word, so no pressure.
No pressure, thank you. Yeah, so I think I wanted to address the issue of enforcing AI ethics. And I'm not sure I have a vision that's sufficient for that. So I'm going to talk about content regulation, moderation regulation, because that I know. But I think, you know, maybe the lesson is valuable for the larger perspective. So what is the idea? The idea is today the situation is not acceptable. So there is the obvious thing, which is to do a regulation. You know, you will regulate the field. And for me, I would say that there are many ingredients, but the most important ingredients is transparency and having the society participate. Because I don't believe that the social media alone can decide. It's too important. If they kill too many content, people are going to say they censor. If they let too many contents go, they're going to say, people are going to complain and say, well, you are hurting society. So whatever they do, they're going to be criticized. Even if they try to the best they can, they're going to be criticized. So I think society has to participate in a regulation. That's one thing. But once I've said that, I feel that it's a very defensive attitude. And when you want to enforce AI through regulation, ethics of AI through regulation, in my opinion, it's really defensive. In the long run, of course, you have to do it, but I think you should stress also other approaches that are more positive, like education. Have people understand what they're doing. Participation. There are places where people moderate and it works. Wikipedia, the editors of Wikipedia, they self-regulate, they self-moderate. of course, it's not. I'm not saying it's easy. They yell at each other, but at the end of the day, it works. Okay, so I would say education, participation of the users, and finally, also different business model, because the business model of the social media today is really part of the problem. But that would be too long to discuss.
Great, thanks so much, Serge, and always good to hear someone advocating also for different models. And as you might know, I've written a book on self-regulation and the internet, which I might share next time. It will be on my placement background here somewhere. But with that, this was a fabulous panel. Thanks so much for all your input. Thanks to the audience to also stay put. The good news is that we've recorded it, so you can watch it again, or those that didn't manage to watch it can also learn and benefit from all the wisdom that was shared here. Thanks so much, and over to you, Julia, for the final thank you.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have everybody here.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.